Welcome to the deep dive. Ready to explore some history?
Always.
Awesome. Today we're tackling the history of nonprofits in the U.S. A listener wrote in wanting to understand how they became such a big part of American life and what it all means for the future.
Big questions.
Huge. Luckily, we've got some great material to dig into. We're going to be looking at excerpts from an academic text all about the history of nonprofits. And believe me, there are some surprises in here.
Oh, I bet. I mean, think about it. 90% of nonprofits today were founded after 1950.
Whoa, really?
Yep. And the way we even think about nonprofits now is totally different from back in the day.
It's true. It's kind of like comparing apples and oranges, right? I mean, for example, think about colonial America. Back then, there wasn't a super clear line between public and private organizations like we have now.
Yeah, it was all kind of blurry. Back then, corporations, even churches and early colleges like, Harvard, they were seen as public entities.
So Harvard was basically like a government agency.
Pretty much.
That's wild. And get this, volunteering was often how people paid their taxes.
I've heard that.
And sometimes it was even required by law. Can you imagine being legally obligated to volunteer?
That's a far cry from how we think of it today. Freely chosen act of service, right?
Totally.
So yeah, that blurry line between public and private. Well, things started to change after the American Revolution. Suddenly, everyone was suspicious of powerful institutions, including charities.
So after fighting for independence from a powerful king, people were a bit wary of anyone having too much power.
Exactly. They didn't want any kind of concentrated power, even if it was meant to do good.
Makes sense.
But this skepticism played out differently in different parts of the newly formed nation,
Oh, how so?
Well, the South, especially Virginia, they really favored public institutions. They were a little hesitant about private charities. But New England, they embraced those private initiatives.
Wow, that's interesting. It's amazing how those regional differences developed. In some ways, they still exist today.
You're right. Then, fast forward to 1819, there's this landmark case, the Dartmouth College Case. The Supreme Court basically said that corporations were protected as private contracts, and that had ripple effects on donor confidence for years to come.
Wait, hold on. How does a legal case about contracts affect donors?
Think about it like this. You're a wealthy individual in the 1800s, and you want to donate a big chunk of money to build a hospital, right? Before this Dartmouth case, there was a risk that the government could just interfere with your donation, or even take over the hospital.
Oh, so donors could basically lose control of what they gave.
Exactly, and that made people hesitate. But this case, it was like a reassurance. It said, hey, your investment in this private organization is protected. And that helped build trust, which led to bigger and bigger philanthropic gifts.
So the case was like a security blanket for donors.
Yeah, you could say that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So then what? What happens next in the history of nonprofits?
Well, as we move into the 1800s, you see this huge trend of Americans really embracing the power of, collective action. It was the era of joiners. Voluntary associations were popping up everywhere.
Like all those social clubs and things.
Yep, political parties, social reform groups, churches, even those fraternal organizations like the Masons.
It seems like everyone was joining something.
They were. Alexis de Tocqueville, that French political thinker who's super fascinated by American democracy, he even wrote about it. He said Americans were forming associations for just about everything. He thought it showed their civic spirit, their belief in working together to get things done.
I wonder what Tocqueville would think of our modern obsession with, online groups and social media communities.
Right. Maybe the platforms are different, but that human urge to band together, it's still there.
It's like it's ingrained in us.
Definitely. Okay, so now let's shift gears a bit to a really pivotal moment in American history. The Civil War. This was a turning point for those private charities we were talking about.
I bet. This is when they really had to step up.
We're big time. The Civil War, especially the massive task of Reconstruction, it really thrust private charities into the spotlight. Groups like the U.S. Sanitary Commission and the U.S. Christian Commission, they popped up to care for wounded soldiers and help newly freed slaves. The government just couldn't handle it all on their own.
It's a pattern we see again and again in history, isn't it?
Yeah.
Whenever there's a crisis, nonprofits are right there filling in the gaps, providing essential services when other systems are overwhelmed.
Absolutely. Look at how they mobilized during those recent natural disasters or public health emergencies. That drive to step up and help, it's like it's in their DNA.
It's pretty inspiring.
Speaking of inspiring, we can't talk about the history of nonprofits without mentioning a true game changer. Andrew Carnegie.
Ah, yes, Andrew Carnegie. He wasn't just about writing checks. He was about changing the whole game of philanthropy. He famously said, placing ladders upon which the aspiring can rise. That sums up his whole philosophy.
It does. He wasn't about handouts, was he?
Not at all. He thought traditional charity often did more harm than good.
Whoa, really? Yep. He believed in strategic philanthropy. Figure out the root cause of the problem and target your giving to address that.
That's a pretty radical idea for his time.
It was, but it caught on. His ideas really resonated with other wealthy industrialists, and that led to a shift toward more strategic, large-scale giving, especially through foundations, which we'll talk about more in a bit.
So his vision didn't just affect his own giving. He sparked a whole movement that still shapes how we think about philanthropy today.
Exactly. He laid the groundwork for a more organized, efficient, and impactful approach to giving, and his influence. It's still felt today.
So Carnegie really pushed for a more strategic approach to giving, didn't he? And that led to some new ways of managing all that charitable money flowing around. Like in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you see foundations and community chests popping up.
Right. Those big foundations, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Sage,
Yeah.
they were all about managing those huge fortunes for maximum impact, really taking Carnegie's idea of strategic giving to heart.
Makes sense.
And then you have those community chests, streamlining fundraising, making sure the money's going where it's needed most within a community. They were like the forerunners of the United Way.
It sounds like they were trying to create a more organized approach to giving. But wasn't there a risk that those community chests, while efficient, might have led to a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to giving? Maybe overlooking the needs of specific communities or those smaller niche causes.
That's a good point. I mean, they definitely aim to tackle the biggest problems, most pressing needs in a community. But yeah, sometimes they might have prioritized those big, broad solutions over the smaller, more targeted initiatives.
It highlights that ongoing struggle in philanthropy, doesn't it? Trying to find the right balance between efficiency and making sure everyone's needs are met.
Absolutely. It's a constant challenge, even with the best of intentions.
Okay, so let's move into the mid-20th century. This is when things start to shift again, right? Big government enters the picture, and that has a huge impact on the nonprofit world.
Yeah, this is when the federal government really steps up and takes on a bigger role in social welfare. And that's how we get this more formalized idea of a nonprofit sector.
So instead of delivering all those social services directly, the government started supporting nonprofits.
Exactly. They did it in a couple of ways. First, they created tax incentives for giving to nonprofits, and then they started directly funding nonprofits through grants and contracts.
So it's kind of like outsourcing some of those social service responsibilities.
You could say that. It's sometimes called third-party government.
Third-party government, what does that mean?
Well, think of it like this. If the government hires a construction company to build a new school, that's a direct service, right?
Yeah.
But if they give a grant to a nonprofit to run after-school programs in that same school, well, that's third-party government. They're working through the nonprofit to provide those services.
Oh, okay, I get it. That makes sense. So nonprofits are becoming even more connected to the government. But didn't this also lead to some concerns? I mean, all that government involvement?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Especially after World War II, there was a huge boom in foundations, partly because of those new government funding mechanisms. And people started getting worried.
Worried about what?
Well, about potential tax avoidance, for one, and also about the influence these big foundations could have. I mean, they were powerful, and with power comes questions about accountability and transparency.
Like a classic checks and balances situation.
Exactly. And it wasn't just the public who was paying attention. This is also the time when we see a lot of grassroots social movements gaining momentum. And guess what? A lot of them were fueled by government policies and, yes, foundation funding.
Interesting. So the nonprofit world was getting more complex,
Yeah.
more connected to the government, more professionalized too.
Definitely. Those movements were different from earlier ones. They were more strategic, more focused on specific issues, and a lot of them were based right in Washington, D.C., so they could lobby and advocate for policy changes more effectively.
So it was a whole new ballgame, really.
It was. Okay, so now we're entering the later part of the 20th century. Another big shift is about to happen.
What happens?
Well, the political landscape starts to change in a big way. The 1980s brought this wave of conservative politics. Smaller government, privatization, a different perspective on social services. And all of that had a big impact on nonprofits.
This is when you see that push to empower nonprofits, right?
Yeah.
Give them more responsibility, less government interference.
Yeah, but here's the thing. It's kind of a paradox. While they were advocating for smaller government, conservative policies actually often made nonprofits more reliant on government funding.
How so?
Because a lot of those services that the government was cutting from its budget, they ended up contracting nonprofits to provide them.
So it was like, we want less government, but here's some government money to do the things we used to do.
Exactly. It was a complicated situation, and it really changed the way nonprofits operated. They had to become more businesslike, more competitive, more savvy about navigating all those government contracts.
So they were being asked to adopt some of the same principles they had always tried to be different from.
Right. It was, and still is, a constant balancing act for nonprofits, trying to stay true to their missions, their independence, while also adapting to these shifting political winds and funding realities.
It sounds like a tough spot to be in.
It can be. And there's another layer to this, too. This era also saw the rise of those conservative think tanks and advocacy groups. They were really active in promoting that conservative agenda, providing research, analyzing policies, lobbying.
So while advocating for less government, they were building a network of nonprofits to push their ideas.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic, isn't it? But that's how it played out, and it had a real impact on public opinion and policy decisions.
Wow, so much was happening. Okay, so where do we go from there? What's next in the nonprofit story?
Well, as we move into the late 20th, early 21st century, globalization really starts to take hold. And that's a game changer for just about everything, including philanthropy.
The world's becoming more interconnected, more interdependent.
Exactly. And we see this new breed of philanthropists emerging, tech billionaires, people like Bill Gates, Sergey Brin. They brought this whole new energy to the field, this global outlook, this focus on results, on making a measurable difference. They were all about leveraging their resources and expertise to solve big global problems.
They weren't just writing checks and hoping for the best.
Nope. They wanted to see real, tangible change. And they weren't afraid to shake things up. Their influence went way beyond their own giving, too. They inspired a whole new generation of philanthropists, and they really helped fuel the growth of social enterprises.
Ah, yes, those organizations that are kind of blurring the lines between business and charity.
Exactly. They're trying to find ways to make money and make a positive impact at the same time, like Google.org, for instance. They're leveraging all of Google's resources and technology to address a whole range of social issues.
It's a fascinating model, isn't it? Using business principles to drive social good. And it's not just the big players doing this. Think about Kiva, those microloans. That's about empowering individuals all over the world to become entrepreneurs.
Exactly. And it's all powered by technology, by the internet. It's really democratized philanthropy in a way. And then there's diaspora philanthropy, those immigrant communities around the world who are supporting development initiatives in their home countries. It's a powerful force.
It really shows how philanthropy has gone global. It's not just about what's happening in our own backyard anymore.
Exactly. It's a global movement with all sorts of different players and approaches. And this brings us to a really crucial point. Nonprofits have become key players on the global stage. They're not just tackling local or national issues anymore. They're taking on those big, complex global challenges. Things like poverty, climate change, human rights.
So we've come full circle in a way. Back in the colonial days, there wasn't a clear separation between public and private. And now, with the rise of all these NGOs, it's almost like we're seeing that blur again. Nonprofits are taking on responsibilities that used to belong to governments.
It is like that, isn't it? A bit of history repeating itself, but in a much more complex and interconnected world. You've got NGOs working on everything from humanitarian aid to environmental protection. They're partnering with governments, businesses, grassroots organizations.
It's a whole new web of relationships and collaboration.
It is. And it's not just about delivering services either. It's about advocating for change, influencing policy, holding those powerful actors accountable. NGOs are really shaping the global conversation in a way they never could before.
Wow, so how did this happen? What led to NGOs taking on such a big role in global affairs?
Well, I think one of the key factors is that nation states are just not equipped to deal with a lot of these global challenges. Take climate change, for example. No single country can solve that on its own. It requires global cooperation, and that's where NGOs really shine. They can be much more agile and adaptable than governments. They can build bridges across borders, bring different stakeholders together to tackle those shared problems.
They can cut through all that red tape and bureaucracy that can slow governments down.
Exactly. And with the internet, with social media, they have these powerful tools to connect with people all over the world, mobilize support, raise awareness. They can really amplify the voices of those marginalized communities, push for policy changes, hold those in power accountable.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about the power and influence that NGOs have today.
It is. And as we move further into the 21st century, their role in shaping global governance, tackling those global challenges, it's only going to become more important.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? From those early days of forced volunteering to the global impact of organizations like the Gates Foundation.
A real whirlwind tour of nonprofit history. It shows how adaptable they are, how they're always evolving to meet the needs of society.
Wow, what a journey through the world of nonprofits. From humble beginnings to global changemakers, they've come a long way.
They have, and they're still evolving, right? I mean, and it makes you wonder, how would someone like Carnegie view philanthropy today?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, he was all about strategic giving, addressing those root causes.
Hmm.
That seems more relevant than ever, right?
Totally. But the scale, the way we do it now, it's all so different.
And you know, his skepticism of traditional charity, I almost feel like that's even more relevant today with all these complex global issues we face. Issues that need real systemic change, not just quick fixes.
You're right. It's not about handouts anymore. It's about tackling those underlying problems.
And one thing this deep dive has really driven home for me is how nonprofits have always been shaped by what's happening in the world around them. You know, wars, economic ups and downs, social movements, that ever-changing relationship between government and the private sector.
Yeah, that push and pull between the two. It's fascinating how the lines were so blurred in the beginning and then they got clearer with the rise of the nonprofit sector, and now they seem to be blurring again with all these NGOs and government contracts.
It's like this pendulum swinging back and forth, but each time it swings, things get a little more complex.
Exactly. And that complexity leads us to a pretty big question. What does all this mean for the future of nonprofits? What's next for them?
Yeah, what opportunities and challenges are out there? It feels like we're at a turning point, doesn't it?
It does. But one thing seems pretty clear to me. Nonprofits are going to play an even bigger role in the 21st century. We've got all these huge challenges, right? Climate change, global inequality, technology disrupting everything, people losing trust in those big institutions.
And those are exactly the kinds of challenges that need collaborative, innovative solutions. And nonprofits, well, they're kind of built for that, aren't they?
They are. They've got that trust, the expertise, the passion for social good. They can adapt and move quickly when needed.
So their role is just going to get more and more important. So what are the things we should be watching for as this landscape keeps changing?
Well, I think the rise of social entrepreneurship is huge. Those lines between business and charity are getting blurrier and blurrier.
We see so many organizations now trying to blend profit with purpose.
Yeah, and that's got a lot of potential, I think. It could unlock all kinds of new resources, lead to some truly innovative solutions. Another big thing is data and technology. Nonprofits are using data to measure their impact, make things more efficient, personalize their services. It's changing everything.
And with all these advancements in AI and machine learning, who knows what's possible?
Exactly. But we have to be careful too, right? It's not just about using the latest and greatest tech. We have to make sure it's being used responsibly, ethically.
For good, not for harm.
Right. And then, of course, there's that ongoing relationship between nonprofits and governments. That's always evolving. And nonprofits need to be smart about navigating those shifts, making sure they maintain their independence and their missions.
It's a tough balance, isn't it? Collaboration and autonomy.
It is. But hey, that's what makes this sector so interesting. It's challenging, but it's exciting.
This whole deep dive has really given me a whole new appreciation for the work that nonprofits do. It's inspiring, really, to see how far they've come and to think about all the possibilities ahead.
It's a sector that's constantly adapting, innovating, finding new ways to make a difference.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the history of nonprofits. We hope you learned something new today, maybe even feel a little inspired. Thanks for joining us.